All right. Thank you. As he said, my name is Beth Campbell Duke, and I am from Saskatchewan. Until 3 years ago, I lived there and taught high school until I decided to drop out. All right, school is a waste of time. When I was in Saskatchewan, I originally moved there because I worked in biotechnology, so I appreciate some of the biotech talks. And then after working with the science fair for quite a number of years, I decided that they don't let us out of the lab enough, so I retooled as a high school science teacher. As a high school science teacher, or high school teacher in general, you can expect to have between 120, maybe up to 135, or 40 kids coming through your classroom on a daily basis. That's a lot of kids to connect with. And so on the first day of school, I always handed out a survey to get a better snapshot of the kids who were in my class, because school isn't everyone's friend, as I told them, and not everybody is there to get a 98 so they can get into nursing or med school. So the last question on this questionnaire said, overall, I feel school, and there was half a page of blank space. And I would get all of these blank looks, and kids would start to panic because I was asking them their opinion. And they would say, what do you want from me? What kind of answer? And I said, well, fill in the blank. Like, school helps me build on my strengths and prepares me for my great future. And I was teaching high school, so I got lots of eye rolling, and a bunch of F-bombs would drop. And then I would get answers like this: school is a waste of time. And as adults, sometimes it's really easy to ignore what teenagers say to us, but it's really difficult to ignore how they said it, because clearly school had been a waste of time. So how did we get here? And this is the sad news. We'll get to some happy news later. But school for a lot of us is a waste of time. We all know about student disengagement. There are kids who are at risk. That population is growing. At-risk kids are those students who are defined as at risk to not graduate. I also had a group that I like to call the conscientious objectors. Those were kids who would show up at school and they would pass, but they had their heels, dug in pretty strongly, and they were there to make a point. Often they were boys and would sit at the back of the room and, would wave with one finger when they waved to you. I kind of like those kids. But we also tend to ignore the other half of this equation of disengagement when we talk about engagement in schools, and that's with teachers. I heard a very good story when I was doing my teacher training in the early 2000s about two teachers who were at the side of a lake, and they saw these kids coming from somewhere and dropping into the lake and struggling, and being teachers who were there to help kids, they found a rowboat and they rowed out into the middle of the lake and started to pull kids out. And as they were pulling these kids out, more kids are coming at a greater and greater rate, and more kids are struggling, until finally one of the teachers picks up the oars and starts heading back to shore. And the person she was with is having a fit. Why are you abandoning these kids here who are drowning and need our help? And she said, I'm going back to shore so that I can find whoever's throwing these kids in and get them to stop. And that's what I have since I became a high school dropout 3 years ago, I have since learned is called moral distress. It's a problem among teachers, but it's also a problem among other people in helping professions, police officers, nurses. You'll hear it an awful lot now that I've given you the term moral distress. It's being talked about a little more frequently. I don't want to belabor, someone already talked about the Industrial Revolution, and it always takes a hit when we talk about school. But understanding how to move forward and how to help the school system evolve into the 21st century and become more relevant, it requires that we understand how we got here to a certain degree. The modern school system was developed in the mid-1800s, depends on the continent you're from, but around there. And it's based on an industrial model, so that we tend to look at how things are done wrong so we can fix them up. And it makes a great deal of sense if you're running a factory, but humans aren't motivated in that way. At the time, it's kind of a double-edged sword. We were training people to take their place in the workforce, but that meant that we wanted school to be a great social leveler, to raise people's basic knowledge of reading, writing, and arithmetic a little bit higher up. And indeed, we still understand math and English to be part of the core curriculum. Part of the problem, however, isn't that what we do. The curriculum is what we teach, but it's in how we teach it. Teachers and educators refer to this as the hidden curriculum. So how we teach kids in school, it has a much longer lasting impact than what we're trying to cram into them. The basic amount of reading, writing, and arithmetic you needed in 1846 was not a whole lot. And there's a certain capacity that we have. We can't be cramming curriculum into kids' heads. And we've heard talks here that are highly technical in nature. And so we understand that in our world, in the 21st century, there's a whole lot more information that our kids need to understand. So how do we move along and help this system evolve? There's a quote here from the British Columbia government, the Premier's Council on Technology. But the BC government isn't the only jurisdiction on the planet looking to reform education. This is happening globally. And when an institution gets around to telling you that it needs to change, it's probably long past time for it to change. Because institutions are very slow to respond. And that's, you know, in some ways it's good. You don't end up being the victim of fads. But, you know, 1846, you know, kids are disengaged and we need to move things along. There are a couple of tenets to what is now termed 21st century education. And the things that we are trying to change are those things that, when you hear people arguing about the school system, often they're not talking specifically about curriculum. They're talking about this hidden curriculum, how we do things. They talk about, you know, well, when I was in school, it was good enough, and we stood in rows and we recited the times tables, and you teachers aren't teaching our kids basic math. Well, you know what? Math isn't just arithmetic. It's a really complex study where kids have to take, and adults have to take complicated ideas and hang them onto numbers and symbols and manipulate those and come up with new understandings. So that we have a whole lot more we're trying to teach them. In 21st century education, what we're hoping to do is more teach the process. So you'll hear things about learning how to learn. Assessment for learning, where students are taught, here's what we need to learn. How are we going to do it? How do you know when you've done a good job? So that students aren't coming up to you as a teacher or a parent and asking you to grade them and saying, did I do well? They should have a fairly solid understanding of how well they've done. All right, so here, this last little bit here says, this requires an increased engagement of parents and the community. This is another tenet of 21st century education, is to disconnect learning from the school and the classroom and an authority at the front of the room, because we need to learn the process, because learning has to now be a lifelong event. So I'm going to outline 3 major ideas that will help all of us, whether or not we're parents or teachers, but just members of the community, to think about helping our students and ourselves. A lot of us, don't forget, we're victims of that system as well, and move forward into the 21st century. The first one is to build on strengths. On the surface, this seems fairly obvious. Why wouldn't we build on strengths? But we're not trained to. This is a big, big problem from that hidden curriculum I talked about. In the factory model of education, we look at, yeah, maybe what we did well, but, who was it who spoke this morning who said when you say but, that sort of shuts the conversation down. And students, and we all remember that from our student days, when, you know, you did fairly well on this assignment, but all you hear is that second part. So if we're hoping to engage students and to really build esteem so that that's where the best learning takes place, we need to focus on strengths. The second one, embrace technology. I used to teach high school. We still have this conversation with parents, with educators, with people in the older generation. You don't want to paint us all with the same brush, but we do tend to, we aren't digital natives, so we tend to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and we see the negative parts of technology, and especially social media, and we want to shut it down. I had firsthand, I've been there. I was in the classroom. One of the little caveats when I was first hired to teach, yeah, we have a great full-time teaching job for you, teaching science, but we need someone to supervise the cheerleaders. So cheerleading wasn't the extracurricular I would have chosen, but that's what I ended up doing. And the very first week of school, we had an incident, of course, of cyberbullying. and the police were involved. And it was, you're too fat and ugly, no one likes you, and it got pretty ugly, and then the police became involved. At the end of the year, some of you may be familiar also with a schoolyard fight that happened in Saskatoon, because while we were all away on the Easter break, there had been a schoolyard fight, and instead of, fight at 4:30 by the flagpole, and 25 kids come, now we have phones and technology. 250 kids showed up. Fight got out of hand. Girls were involved, kicking of heads, videotaping, upload to YouTube. National news. So when we got back from our Easter break, police were involved, and we had to debrief an entire student body about how, it wasn't about social media, that was only a bit of the problem, but we had to talk to these kids about how we treat each other. Embracing technology. So the thing is that kids are in this space. I like to tell parents the future is online, it's mobile, and it's here. So if you don't know how to text, if you're not friends with your kids on Facebook, you need to step up to the plate and learn how to do it. Facebook can be used for evil by adults as well. So, if you close that loop with your kid's high school science teacher, and you know that parents are invited to, the science fair next Friday, there's going to be a whole big conversation at the dinner table that no longer goes, do you have any homework? No. What'd you learn in school? Nothing. Because you know. So, use it for evil yourself. It's really great. And the last one, this is part of that 21st century schooling that they talked about in that excerpt that I showed you on evolution, was we need to connect more with the community. I really like this idea of the spider web because there are, this brings to mind two big ideas for me, and I really like that there's webs here and making connections. The first is that we have isolated kids in high school based on age. So, that goes through all of school. So kids are isolated based on what year they were born. And then in high school, we take all of the curriculum subjects and we separate them. And so at a time of our lives when our brains are doing the most rejigging of information, we have kids isolated. And so there's no context for them. They're isolated from the community. And so if this is the second part of this, we need to help them make these connections, because that's the part of your brain functioning that leads to critical thought. And so if we can connect kids with the community, connect our kids, not just with kids that are in their own age group, but kids who are younger than they are, so you can act as a mentor, to connect them with adults in the community so that they are the mentee, and they can start to learn that they have knowledge, yes, but they're part of a bigger picture and they still have much to learn. That's going to be a real benefit. Plus, if you can find parents in the community to supervise cheerleading, that would be awesome, because then I can go and do the science fair. All right, so I'll leave us with the words of Mark Twain. When I practiced this talk in front of my husband, he said, "Why do you have a picture of Einstein and a quote from Mark Twain?" So I think he's getting his eyes checked. Mark Twain had this pegged 100 years ago, and he said that I have never let my schooling interfere with my education. So he understood at that time, as a lot of us have, but now we're getting to the crux of this and we really need to move things forward, that the institution of schooling is separate from the goals of education. And while, maybe in 1846 they were a little bit disjointed, now we've moved along with what we need to be teaching kids and how we need to be teaching them, and the institution has not changed effectively. And so now it's time to put those together, so that when we go into a classroom and we ask kids, overall I feel school, we don't get that it's a waste of time. We start to get more kids really saying, you know what, school is a place where I come to develop my strengths and to create a good life for myself in the future. Thank you. Thank you.